Okay, we'll make this one a quick one. Microphone in. Now then. Oh, yeah, it's all right. You don't need to settle down too much, mate. We're not going to be here long. Right. Final day on the cookie cutter stuff. Really just adding in the documentation system. Now, it seems that most of my projects are developing a kind of common theme, and that is adding in a Python virtual environment using poetry, principally for the purposes of adding documentation using Sphinx, but also because it adds things like pre-commit and Mitizen, which I'm going to be using a lot. Why put those into a Common Pi project? Well, I mean, it's not strictly necessary because most of them are added into my global development virtual environment anyway. But for those people who don't use my global virtual environment, it makes sense that if they want to check out the project and still have it work the way it's supposed to, adding in the poetry project is fairly simple because all they do is issue poetry install, poetry shell, and they're in an environment where everything works the way it's supposed to. So, yeah, I've added that into the formula. Into the cookie cutter and into the formula. So it goes into the cookie cutter and into the formula. So when you run the when you run the cookie cutter to generate the formula, you get the same environment basically. So you can generate the documentation for your particular formula, and it puts in a framework of documentation. The next decision I've got to make is what to do about the history of this project. All the work I've done so far has been on a rework feature branch. Now, anybody who does short-lived feature branches is going to have a absolute conniption fit because it's been what, 10 days since I started this branch, and you know, people who do trunk development will be like, oh man, you should have been like committed every day or committed every 15 minutes or whatever. To which I say, well, yeah, I mean, you're right. We could do it that way. And you know, this could have been done that way. Each commit really continues to work. But I decided to keep it all separate until now, partly because I'm working on my own, so it doesn't really matter. The question now becomes, what do I do with it? Do I now do a fast forward merge and just leave all the other garbage that really isn't really very relevant? Because you know, there's a lot of stuff to do with the way Tobias Macy, the guy whose project I did base this off, like several years ago, was adding in all the vagrant stuff, which I've now ripped out. But the question is, do I now just sort of go, yeah, I'll just start a completely new repository, or do I preserve that history? I mean, I suppose really I should preserve the history. It doesn't cost anything other than a little bit of baggage in the repository. So, I don't know. I'll have a think about it. It's such a radically different way of doing it. And I've changed a lot of stuff inside the formula itself. So, for example, I no longer have all the switches for if it was generated for MIT, they had a very specific test regime. I've taken all that out. It doesn't matter. The test regime is largely irrelevant now with the Docker stuff. If you want to put it in, then you could do. But having it in as a switch, I don't know. It just doesn't seem right. So there's that. I didn't press done on that. Yeah, now it's done. Having said that, I've got a feeling that's still 31. 32. Yeah. So yeah, so that's all done. So now we can start work on the Gittier project. And to that end, let me see. Right. Oh, that's connected to that one. Right. So to that end, if we go to Gittier, go to the Gittier project page, the main thing we're interested in here is if we go to the documentation. Now you can see there are different ways of installing. Now this is fairly common with the setups. So for example, we can set it up with Docker. We can set it up with Docker rootless. We can set it up with a binary. And of course, there's the separate issue of the databases, which again, you can set up inside a Docker. You can set up inside. Do you know what? It pisses me off. We can set up inside a container. There we go. Or we can put it in from a package for a large number of operating systems, and we can set up a service. So this is a fairly common pattern with third-party stuff where you want to be able to say things like, well, okay, which one is the most broadly acceptable, and then work your way backwards. Well, setting up from binary kind of seems right to me. So we go down to the download. This seems to be the most sort of generic way. So we can pick it up by version, and then almost everything that you need is in here. And if we go back to installing it by, Docker, again, is fairly straightforward. So we could certainly do most of that without too much trouble. And we've got packages for a lot of operating systems. So, Alpine, Arch. So it's fairly easy for us to detect and deal with those in Salt. The only one I'm not going to bother with is from source. Well, I suppose. So all of these can be basically set up with a very simple pillar. Now APK add Gittier, that's no good. Obviously we need to have it associated with a very specific version. So now you can see here with brew, it's a two-step process. We're going to be a bit careful. But most of these things we've got. So APK, Macman, N2s with a merge, canonical with a fucking awful system. So it's, yeah, So the next step is to start constructing the package around it. So, and this is all of this stuff, all of this complexity with deciding on how to install it is that's all fairly vanilla, and that just installs the Git binary. Precondition is having Git installed, so we can do that, and we can look at the ways of doing that. The simplest way that I can think of at the moment is to have a flag install Git from package, for example, which defaults to true, and all it does is do a package install of Git, which should work on most platforms. The alternative is package install being set to false, in which case all we need to do is verify that Git is installed. So the formula will make no attempt to actually install Git. All it will do is check to see if Git is installed, and if it isn't, it'll fail. Then you've got the database issue, and it's very much the same. The databases, essentially, we can choose between MySQL, Postgres, and that's it in terms of stuff that is approved. And again, we can just check to make sure that it exists. We don't need to do much in terms of installing it. I guess we could do an install database option as part of the formula, but I'm not overly keen on doing that because it involves we could add it in as a recommended package as part of the SPM, and we could then do the check to make sure that the database actually exists at the point where your configuration says it should be, and make it a sort of precondition, a bit like Git. Yeah, maybe that's the way to go. Right, so there's that. And then we can move on to the actual installing it on the server.